Welcome back to the Commodore 64 Compilation Comparison, and in this episode I'm going to be looking at the biggest compilation I've looked at so far with 6 games. It's Thalamus's The Hits 1986 to 1988. This was released in 1989 and cost £12.99 for the cassette version. So was it worth that amount of money? Well, there's only one way to find out, isn't it? Let's take a look at it. Let's begin this review with a look at the packaging then, as I always do, and this one is a bit mashed. It's a big box compilation that's over 35 years old, so, you know, fair enough. But it doesn't look too bad. You can get the idea of what it was intended to be like. It's a very stylish look, lots of white, a nice Thalamus logo at the top. The Hits written in quite small text comparatively, and then it's got the box art for the 6 games on there. So you've got Sanxion, Delta, Quedex, Hunter's Moon, Hawkeye and Armalyte. Looking on the sides, it's pretty much the same on all the sides, just the Thalamus logo, and it says The Hits on 2 sides of it, so there and there. And then moving on to the back, which is more mashed than the front. It's got a big rip in it, but it says 6 smash hits, bringing you the very best from Thalamus's first 2 years. These games are so hot they've received more awards than there can be mentioned here. Big list of the different awards from the magazines. It's the ultimate collection this year. And then on the back it's got the overview of the 6 games, which I won't bother with at the moment because I'll go through those when we look at them in more detail. But no screenshots, surprisingly, just a very blank bit of white space. But they're obviously going for more sort of style over substance with the look of it, giving it a sort of classier look than a lot of the compilations that would have been released at the time. So moving inside the box, you get some foam, and you also get 3 cassettes with one of the games on each side, so that's quite nice. No jamming them all onto one cassette. And as you can see from the cassette labels, the names of the games with their respective logos are printed on the labels, so that's quite nice. Not sure why one of them's a weird creamy brown colour and the other 2 cassettes are black, but there we go. And then we move on to the instructions, and they are quite comprehensive. You've got the front, that's the front cover there basically, and then you've also got the details of what games are on which cassettes or discs and the loading instructions, and then quite a lot of information and nice presentation for each game. So that's Sanxion there with the logo and a bit of artwork. You've then got Delta below that, again lots of instructions and detail about all the power-ups and things like that. There's Quedex, which is a little bit more concise, I guess you would say, but that's just in respect to the game. It's not got a huge backstory or anything like that. Then moving on to the other side, we've got Hunter's Moon again and Hawkeye next to that. They're kind of crammed in a bit randomly. You've got like bits of Hawkeye sticking out into the Hunter's Moon description there, and then there's more of the Hunter's Moon one underneath. But they've made a nice job of putting lots of detail in all the instructions despite it being the compilation, and also having the artwork and logos from some of the games is quite a nice thing too. So overall I think the presentation's really nice and the instructions are really comprehensive for every game. Let's take a look at an advert for the compilation. This came from the pages of Zap64, although I imagine it was published in a number of other magazines as well. And it really doesn't tell you anything more than the packaging does. It's just a different layout of the same information that was on the packaging. It's got the same visual style with the white background, the Thalamus logo and the Hits printed in red, although it's not particularly prominent on this advert. You've then got the box art for the 6 games laid out just as it is on the packaging, with Sanxion sitting above the other 5, and there's none of the stuff you'd typically see on other adverts for compilations. There's no magazine review scores, no screenshots, no superlatives. It's just got the same information it had on the back of the box and then the prices for the cassette and disc versions of the compilation. So overall it's a pretty understated advert, not really shouting about anything too much, just letting the games do the talking, and I suppose if you knew about these games already then that's exactly what they do. Moving on to the games then, and first up is Sanxion, originally released by Thalamus in 1986 and the first of 3 games on this compilation developed by Stavros Fasoulas. The instructions for this game have a really elaborate backstory that spans several paragraphs, but effectively it boils down to aliens have invaded Earth and America and Russia jointly set up Project Damocles, a think tank to discuss global defence for the inevitable conflict between man and alien. From this came Operation Sanxion, a proposal for Defence Corps to pilot a breed of ship based around existing weaponry and technology gleaned from a crashed alien spacecraft. Unsurprisingly, the game sees you taking on the role of a pilot of one of these craft. In Sanxion, you'll encounter a variety of aliens using different tactics to dominate various parts of the planet. As a member of the Sanxion Corps, it's up to you to destroy any alien infiltration. At the start of each sector, you'll take off from a regen station and return to it at the end of each mission. As each level starts, a timer begins to count down, and reaching a regen station and completing the mission before the timer hits 0 earns additional points. Extra ships are awarded for every 10,000 points you achieve. After each sector is successfully defended, the pilot must go through a short training session to prepare him for the horrors to come. These sessions take place against a rainbow background, and the task on each section is indicated by letters on the droid targets. You'll either be shooting them, colliding with them, or picking them up. Should you prove a competent trainee, you're awarded an extra bonus of 1,000 points.
As well as attacking aliens, there are a number of other hazards that need to be negotiated. Some of the regen stations are protected by security barriers, and to the less skillful pilot they can prove deadly. Of course, the astute pilot will commit to memory the layout of all the security barriers. Once all 10 world sectors have been patrolled, you're promoted to Sanxion Class 1 and go on to patrol the dark side and do battle against the Empire's secondary attack system. As Thalamus' first game, Sanxion really set the quality standard for aesthetics that subsequent releases would live up to or exceed. It's got really nice graphics and fantastic parallax scrolling and a cool metallic look to the backgrounds, though it has to be said some of the backgrounds can be quite distracting and stop you seeing certain enemies or obstacles. The overhead view at the top of the screen is nicely implemented, but I think it's largely pointless, at least on the early levels, which is all I've seen of the game. I'm pretty sure it's there just to show how clever the programmer was rather than serving any real purpose in the game. The in-game sounds are decent enough and fairly typical for the genre. I do like the throbbing engine noise, but otherwise it's just regular sound effects like laser shots and explosions, and there's no music in-game. Once you get into the action, there's two ways to attempt each stage. You can go slow and try and destroy as many enemies as possible, or speed up and get through the level as quickly as possible before the time limit runs out and get the bonus, which earns you more points. If you're going to attempt the latter approach, then you'll need super fast reactions and some luck to get through at high speed. The between stage training levels are good for upping your score, and from the second stage onwards you'll need as many points as you can get, as you'll almost certainly lose some lives towards the end as you have to avoid indestructible barriers at high speed. The barriers are hard to see against the background even if you weren't going fast, and it's pretty unfair as it's total guesswork to get past them until you've learned the layout, and even then it's hard due to the speed you travel at through this section. These parts of the game are what spoil it somewhat, as it turns from a challenging skill-based game to a memory test, which isn't a lot of fun. Even outside of these sections, the collision detection seems harsh at times as you occasionally get blown up when you haven't obviously made contact with anything. Sanxion looks the part and is programmed really well, but it's a super hard game and I've never got past level 3. I think perseverance and practice are probably required, but it's a little too frustrating to want to. The game scored highly in magazines upon release, but it was probably overrated a little bit at the time, and I don't think it's aged especially well compared to some of the games that followed it. Let's move on to the next game then. This is Delta, originally released in 1987. This is another horizontally scrolling shooter, and like Sanxion it was programmed by Stavros Vassoulis, and based on the premise it's effectively a sequel to his first game. Yet again the Earth is in deadly peril as diplomatic relations with the Hasifian Khanate disintegrate into tatters. The Hasifians are hell-bent on destroying the Earth, and to combat this insidious alien threat, Project Damocles has been reformed. As a member of that elite squadron, your mission is to obliterate as much of the alien attack fleet as possible. You're advised to enhance your ship's abilities so as to improve your chances. Most of the attacking formations yield a credit if they're completely destroyed, and depending on how many credits have been earned, extra weaponry can be bolted onto the ship. Power-ups may be acquired in the weapon collection screens, which are a group of icons that frequently cross your path between alien attacks. Each icon has its price, and the extras you can afford are highlighted in blue, while unavailable items are grey. Just fly over the desired icon and within seconds more death powers at your disposal. Be wary though, because colliding with the grey icon will destroy your ship. You must also remember that weapons are not permanent, and after a preset time they start to fade away. The game consists of 32 levels, all of which feature hordes of aliens to destroy, but some of which also feature landscape that needs to be avoided. Now I couldn't talk about Delta without mentioning the fantastic Rob Hubbard music on the title screen, which is one of his finest SID compositions and just part of some great overall presentation for the game, which includes a nice demo showing you how to play. Once you dive into the game, you're treated to some lovely metallic sheen graphics, the like of which would soon become a hallmark of C64 shooters. There's also a good variety of enemies and some basic but nicely drawn scenery on some stages. The in-game sound effects are again typical for the genre. There's nothing especially noteworthy, but they do the job, and you can have music on in-game instead if you wish. Gameplay wise, this is very much inspired by Konami's Gradius, as you start off weak and have to shoot down waves of enemies to collect credits for power-ups. Your ship's very slow to begin with, so you have to focus on powering that up first. The power-up method's fairly original but also quite odd, as you collect these icons that drift across the screen periodically, and it's annoying that you can lose a life by crashing into the ones that you haven't got enough credits for. In addition to the speed boost, there's a good range of weapons power-ups including multi-way fire, improved forward fire, an orbiting drone and shields. Unlike Gradius, you don't lose all your power-ups when you lose a life, so that's quite good, though some power-ups do run out eventually and it can be hard to get enough credits on later stages to replenish them. You can also power up your speed too much so that it's almost too hard to control the ship, and it's also possible to power down your speed to its base level, which makes things really hard if this happens on the later stages. It would have been better if you could stack up credits to allow collection of the better power-ups rather than losing them if you don't pick one up when you get the chance. Aside from the power-ups, another thing I like is that you can hold down the fire button for auto-fire, which makes it a lot more enjoyable as you can focus on shooting or evading the enemy formations rather than continually hammering the fire button. Your thumb will certainly be grateful as the game's fast-paced with no let-up between levels as one flows into another. The game doesn't have many similarities with Fasulis' earlier game Sanxion, but it does have the same impenetrable barriers that you have to avoid on some stages. However, your ship can be powered up to be fast enough to avoid them, and they are easier to see coming due to the simpler backgrounds. Much like Sanxion and most other shooters, to be fair, it's very much a memory test, so needs lots of replaying, but perseverance is rewarded as you do get further as you learn the enemy formations. Some of the levels can be a bit samey and it does have a few flaws, but overall Delta's a great game and very influential on later C64 shooters. The next game on this compilation is Quedex, although I've also heard it pronounced as Quedex. However, the subtitle for the game is The Quest for Ultimate Dexterity, so I think Quedex is right. Anyway, this was released in 1987 and is the third and final game on this compilation developed by Stavros Fasoulis. Unlike the first two games of this compilation, there's no complicated backstory for this one. The game consists of 10 planes where the player steers a ball and must find an exit square in order to leave the maze-like play area. The 10 levels can be played in any order the player chooses, although typically you'd start with the introductory level, which teaches the player the mechanics of gameplay over 5 short stages. The remaining 9 planes introduce varied challenges such as collecting items, jumping, going through teleports and finding keys that open gates. Each level has a time limit, and when that expires the game is over, but complete a plane and any remaining time is added to your score as a bonus. You'll then move on to a brief bonus stage in which a set sequence of directions has to be repeated to earn more points. Like all Thalamus games, Quedex has great presentation, very much arcade style with a high score table and a track mode style demo. Graphics are never going to be the most important thing in a game like this, but they're nice and simple with everything clearly discernible and the ball is well animated. The in-game sound effects are nothing special, but some of the levels do have nice little SID tunes and the title screen music is great. This may not be a shooter, but it does have characteristics similar to Fasulis' earlier games, even if the gameplay is very different. It's an interesting mix of skill and puzzle solving that requires mastery of the precise controls, but it does have similar failings to Fasulis' other games. Skill alone won't get you very far. You also need a good memory, tons of practice and no small amount of luck. There definitely seems to be a strategy to completing the levels. For example, you should probably leave level 7 where you get the time bonus till later, and do the easy ones early on, but the level number is not necessarily an indicator of difficulty. There's lots of trial and error needed on some stages and the time limits are very tight, so you're almost certainly going to lose out the first time you play them. If you do get past a plane, then the bonus stage is effectively a game of Simon. It's pretty easy to get the points as long as you pay attention. It's good that you can play the levels in any order because some of them are really hard and you'll want to skip them, though the later you leave some of the levels the harder they become. If you're finding things too hard to cope with, the plane programmer lets you alter the order of levels or even skip certain ones if you wish. It can be hard to figure out what to do on some stages even with instructions, and it's probably impossible to complete all 10 stages in one run. Some levels seem impossible, such as level 3 where the collectibles randomise every time and it's hard to find the exit as it's also randomly placed. Another tough one's level 8 where the floors disappear before you can find the exit. As a result of the high difficulty level and tight time limit, the game can be very frustrating, but it also has an addictive quality and the short game time means you probably will keep trying. Having said that, more levels with a proper difficulty curve and no need for luck would have made for a better game, and I do think some of the magazine ratings this got were probably a little bit over the top. Up next we have Hunter's Moon, which was originally released by Thalamus in 1987. You play the role of the captain of a spaceship called Hunter. Unfortunately you got a bit carried away putting Hunter through its paces and were caught in a black hole. You were warped into a system consisting of hive-like crystal cities that are constantly regenerated. The only way home is to take out the star cells that are protected within each of these space cities. Hunter's Moon is divided into 16 star systems, each with a number of levels. To finish each level you have to collect all the star cells which are visible on the radar. Collecting a star cell gives temporary immunity from spores which are launched by the cells defending the cities. Single white worker cells will repair the cities but can't be destroyed. When all levels within the current star map have been completed, you automatically enter a bonus game. Here you'll gain a perma-shield and be awarded an extra craft if you can destroy all 8 enemies. Perma-shields can be selected from the in-game menu and shield you from spores for the duration of that level or until you lose a life. When you enter a level, one star cell will be flashing on the radar. If you collect this one before the status symbol counts down to 0, you'll gain 1 coordinate for loop space. If you manage to gain all 4 coordinates for the system, you'll automatically complete it. This allows experienced players to skip to later levels more quickly. I don't remember ever playing this game back in the day, and when I started playing, what I liked about it is it's got quite a generous learning curve to begin with. The first few stages are fairly easy before the difficulty ramps up on later levels. This isn't a typical shooter by any means. It requires patience and strategy, as just moving around blasting will end up getting you killed. You need to carefully time entry into the clusters of crystals so that the drones rebuilding them don't collide with you. The controls are precise, although it can feel a bit sluggish to get moving initially, but being able to hold down the joystick button for autofire is definitely helpful on the later levels. Once you complete the stage in each system, you get a choice of which stage to go to next, so it's nice that you've got some control over level progression and some variety in which order you tackle the stages. You can also choose one of 3 engine types for your ship to suit your style of play, as well as change the ship's colour. These options are changed via the pause mode, which also allows you to engage shields and enter off-duty mode, which treats you to a neat light show. The bonus stage between systems is fun and adds some more typical fast-paced shooter action compared to the more strategic main stages. The game's graphics are simple but nicely drawn, with lots of variety in the crystal designs, though it is sometimes quite heavy on the brown. Your disc-shaped main ship is a nice change from the usual sleek designs of most games, and its explosion animation is great, though obviously not fun to see over and over again. Audio-wise, there's some nice spacey sound effects in-game and an excellent Matt Gray tune on the title screen. This is undoubtedly a well-made game, but it does get frustrating after the first system, as even tiny mistakes can cause you to lose lives, and later stages need lots of practice and patience. The third system seems to be near impossible without shields, as you have homing bullets and have to hit crystals multiple times to destroy them. I've never got past that stage, but I can only imagine how difficult it gets beyond that. I found the collision detection when collecting star cells can be a little bit annoying. You seem to be in line with them sometimes but don't pick them up, and the radar can also be misleading on their position. Another niggle is your vertical field of view isn't particularly wide, so you can go into a cluster and not know if an enemy's going to cross paths with you. Despite the criticisms I've just made, this is definitely an interesting game though, and the slower strategic action is a nice change of pace from the other shooters on the compilation. Next up we have the first of 2 games released in 1988, Hawkeye. In yet another elaborate backstory, we're told that the planet Zamox is home to an almost perfect civilization, but a race of space nomads called the Scrixis found the Zamoxians too perfect. Their forces invaded Zamox, viciously massacring its perfect race and making a base on the planet. A few Zamoxians survived the massacre and went into hiding in underground chambers, vowing to seek revenge. Working for generations, the survivors developed a synthetic life form, half robot, half human, specially designed to break through the heavily guarded sector leading to the radiation plants established by the Scrixis. The synthetic life form is called Hawkeye and has been released into the savage wilderness of New Zamox. The aim of the game is to collect 4 puzzle pieces scattered about each of the 12 levels. The eye of either Hawkhead on the left or right of the top of the screen winks in the direction of the next piece to be collected. When all the pieces have been collected, Hawkeye should be manoeuvred to the far right of the level to complete it. Hawkeye is equipped with 4 deadly weapons, and there are 2 ways to select these. You can hold down fire until the weapon icon glows and then move left or right to select the armament you want, or alternatively you can select the required weapon by pressing a function key. The 4 weapons are a pistol, machine gun, laser and rocket launcher. The pistol is the first weapon option and has unlimited ammunition, but inflicts little damage on the larger monsters. All other weapons are increasingly more powerful but have limited ammunition, though this can be replenished by pickups during the game and is fully restored at the beginning of each level. All Thalamus games were known for high quality graphics, but few would argue that Hawkeyes are the best on this compilation. The main character's got some lovely animation and there's a great variety of enemies, including some big ones that are really well drawn, such as gorillas and dinosaurs. The backgrounds are good too and feature some fabulous parallax scrolling, but some of them are quite busy, so player and enemy sprites can be lost on them. This is a fairly rare example of a game that's got sound effects and music in game, although either can be turned off. The music consists of several great heavy rock influenced SID tunes, though the sound effects are pretty standard for this kind of game. What this kind of game is a very playable run and gun with some platforming elements, where you can decide to shoot or avoid most enemies. You've got a good range of different weapons which are pretty easy to switch between using either the joystick or function keys, and the choice of weapons does seem to matter for eliminating some of the larger enemies. The game's also pretty generous with ammo pickups for the weapons. Generally the controls are intuitive and responsive, though it would be better if you could drop down from platforms using down and fire, as there are some levels with long upper sections that you can't drop down from. There aren't many negative points to the games, but sometimes I did find it hard to find the puzzle pieces. The flashing eyes on the hawks seem to suggest they're one way and then they're the other. I wonder if perhaps they move if you don't find them quickly enough. It's a little unfair that your health can dwindle naturally rather than just due to being hit by enemies, and the low health warning sound is really annoying. Before you learn the level layouts, you may also get the occasional cheap death from falling down a hole you didn't notice due to it blending into the background. One good point though is that when the game's over, you're able to practice the level you died on, which is a really nice idea, especially as the game's a multi-load. I found Hawkeye relatively easy compared to most games of the era. The gameplay is quite balanced and it's got a fair difficulty curve. In retrospect, you'd probably say the game's somewhat repetitive, but it's a fun arcade style blast and I had no complaints about it when it was originally released. The sixth and final game on this compilation is Armalyte, originally released in 1988. This was promoted as a sequel to Delta despite having completely different developers. The story takes place 200 years after the earlier game, with Armalyte Industries being the dominant power in space after the Hasifian incarnate was all but destroyed during the events of Delta. Armalyte have established a research base in the ruins of an old Hasifian outpost in Delta space, but all communication with the base has recently been lost and it's believed to be under enemy control. Your mission is to enter Delta space and reclaim the outpost. The Hasifians have an almost limitless supply of ships and firepower, but to counter this you can equip your ship with state-of-the-art weaponry. Across the deep space battlefield there are munitions pods to collect. These provide the ship with a massive energy surge, activating the inner-built shield which renders you invulnerable for a while. Continually shooting the pods provides the ship with weaponry, and the more shots the pod takes the better the weapon received. The game supports 2 simultaneous players, but if you're fighting alone there's a remote unit which fires as you do and follows your every move unless you detach it from the ship. Your craft's also equipped with 3 super weapons, which are fired by holding down the fire button for a few seconds. Your ship stores 6 energy charges and firing a super weapon will use up 1 or more of these. Once they're depleted you'll have to wait for a generator to build up power before you can use a super weapon again. The game features 8 long horizontally scrolling levels, most of which feature mid and end of level bosses. I am quite dubious that this game was originally designed to be a sequel to Delta, but it does draw heavily on that game's metallic graphical style. This time they're much more detailed and varied though, with extensive backgrounds and a large variety of moving enemies and gun emplacements. Every level has a distinctive look, the drawback to this being that the game is a multi-load, though to be fair, most big games were at this point in the Commodore 64's life. Sound-wise, the game doesn't quite live up to the standards set by the graphics. There's a reasonably nice soundtrack on the title screen, but in-game it's sound effects only, and they are quite bland. As most horizontal shooters released after 1987 were, this one's heavily R-type influenced, with a permanent drone in one player mode that you can use to defend your ship or lock into position to focus on a specific area of the screen. I describe the weapon system as a mixture of R-type and Gradius, as you have to shoot power-ups to access the higher level weapons. The power-up pods are offered frequently and you will need them because like most shooters it's really hard and you'll need lots of practice, precise skills and mastery of when to lock the drone or keep it close to defend yourself. One thing that will help is just like Delta, you retain all your weapons when you lose a life, so you're not left stranded in a difficult part of the level with no firepower. The bosses do tend to look quite similar from one level to the next, but they do offer an interesting challenge, as you have to work out where to place your drone to have the most impact whilst avoiding their shots. When there's lots of enemies on screen, you may lose your craft in the mix as everything has similar colours, and there are several areas where you'll crash into the scenery or indestructible objects if you don't have the shield. The game's got 8 very long, very tough levels, so there's lots of longevity in this one and you'll probably need infinite lives to see the end of it, though the 2-player mode may give you more of a chance and adds more to the game's playability. Armalyte definitely offers up a serious challenge, but it's one of the best horizontal shooters on the system, and when you consider just how many were released, that's high praise indeed. That concludes the detailed look at these 6 games, so let's now round things up and give them some ratings. Sanction's a highly polished game, but one that's frustratingly hard and frequently unfair. It's one for hardcore players only, and the lack of replayability for me means that perhaps controversially it only gets 6 out of 10. Delta put a lot of the mistakes that Thalamus made with Sanxion right. It's a pretty straightforward Gradius-inspired horizontal shooter, but the implementation and graphical style are both excellent, and it's very playable once you get used to it, so I'm giving it 8 out of 10. Quedex is an interesting concept that requires a mix of dexterity and puzzle solving. It has plenty of flexibility, but it's frustrating because skill will only get you so far due to the tight time limits and randomness of some stages. For that reason I'm giving it 7 out of 10. Hunter's Moon is a slower paced shooter than the others on the compilation, with an initially simple premise that doesn't take long to become really hard. That ultimately loses it a mark or two as frustration sets in due to lack of progress, but the relative freedom of movement through levels and the other customization options do temper that a little. It's another one I'm going to give 7 out of 10. Hawkeye is probably the best game on the compilation in terms of audio and visuals. Gameplay wise it's fairly repetitive, but it has a generous difficulty curve that should help you get fairly deep into the game, and it's a lot of fun blasting all the different enemies. It's a solid 8 out of 10 from me. And finally, Armalyte is not only the best game on the compilation, but also the best horizontal shooter I've played on the C64. It's a seriously tough game, but it looks great with fantastic level design, a clever weapon system, and the 2-player option gives it extra replayability. I've got no qualms about giving this one a score of 9. Looking at the compilation as a whole, Thalamus was well known for top quality games, and this collection of their first 6 proves that, with all of them being very polished and offering many hours of gameplay. It is very heavy on the shooters and most of the games are quite hard, but there's still variety between them, and even the weakest game in this collection is of a high standard. So I'll move on now to give this compilation an overall rating, and starting with the packaging, well, my copy hasn't aged particularly well, but it certainly looked high quality at the time of release, with excellent detailed instructions that have artwork too, and no cheaping out on the number of tapes. The only real issue is there's no screenshots on the back of the box, but I guess the names of the games did enough to sell this package, and with that in mind I'm giving it a score of 9 out of 10. The average score for the 6 games comes out at 7.5, and in terms of value for money, well, this compilation costs £12.99, which works out at £2.17 per game, and for that you get 2 of the best shooters on the system, a superb run and gun, and 3 solid supporting acts. It was slightly more expensive than most similar big box compilations of the time, but it was easily worth it, and for that reason I'm going to give it a perfect value for money score of 10 out of 10. And that gives the compilation an overall score of 83%. Let's now take a look at a magazine review for this compilation, and it appears that Zap didn't review this one, which is perhaps not too surprising since it was published by the same company that owned Thalamus. The only review I could find was from the pages of Your Commodore, and this is from issue 65, published in February 1990. It's only a small review as part of a larger feature on compilations, and it does feature 2 game screenshots from the compilation, strangely both of Quedex. The review only takes up the leftmost column of this page and says Thalamus is a small software house with a big reputation and has carved its own niche in the blast alien scum market. It goes on to say it's released the software equivalent of this greatest hits album, and it offers 6 games for the price of 1. It says that Sanxion, Delta, Hunter's Moon and Armalyte all offer various permutations of blasting aliens, while Hawkeye offers hack and slay action, which is not correct, and then there's the abstract but excellent Quedex that consists of puzzle after puzzle to torment your reflexes and mangle your mind. The review is concluded by saying this one redefines the word addictive, and the score is actually above the text there at 77%, which isn't too different from the score I've just given it, though I'm surprised they didn't rate it a little bit higher given how highly regarded the 6 games were at that point in time. I'll bring this review to a close then by looking at where the hits 1986 to 1988 ended up in my compilation rankings, and if you've been following this series from the start then you'll probably already know that it's gone straight in at number 1, ousting the previous leader We Are The Champions with a score of 3% higher. It's also finally not the terrible Magnum Pack Volume 1 off the bottom of the league table. So that about does it for this edition of the Commodore 64 Compilation Comparison. That was the biggest compilation I've reviewed so far with 6 games, but next time around I'm going to be going even bigger. If you agreed or disagreed with my review of this episode's compilation then please be sure to leave a comment, and if you enjoyed this video then I'd appreciate you giving it a like or sharing it. I'll be back with another compilation review in about a month's time, and in the meantime there'll be plenty of other interesting content on my channel. Thanks very much for watching this video, and until the next time, see ya!